Have you ever stopped to wonder why we have high-resolution maps of every single square inch of Mars, yet we have explored less than 5% of our own ocean floor? Think about that. We can drive a rover on a red planet millions of miles away, but we have no idea what is happening in the basement of our own home. If you ask the government, or the Navy, or the scientific community, they will give you the standard, rehearsed answer. They'll tell you it's too expensive. They'll tell you the pressure at 20,000 feet is too crushing for a technology to handle. They want you to believe that it's a hardware problem. But what if that's a lie? What if the reason the deep ocean is off limits has nothing to do with budget cuts or physics? What if the reason we stopped going down there isn't because we can't, but because we were told not to? I'm not talking about politics between nations. I'm talking about a treaty. A silent, terrifying agreement between the surface world and something that has been claiming the deep as its territory long before we climbed down from the trees. Welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, get comfortable, because today we are going into the deep end. I recently received a file of final testament, really from a former high-level operative who claims to know the real reason why the military strictly avoids the Hadal zones. He broke the silence, and he paid for it with his sanity. Today, we are going to find out what he saw in the dark. If you're ready for the truth, hit that subscribe button, and let's dive in. Usually, when I cover stories like this, the information comes to me through an anonymous email or a burner account on a secure server. It's digital. It's distant. But this was different. This story didn't arrive in my inbox. It arrived as a set of coordinates. 3 weeks ago, I took a flight to Anchorage, Alaska, followed by a 4-hour drive into the kind of wilderness where cell phones are just paperweights. The meeting point was a cabin so far off the grid, it doesn't even register on satellite imaging. I wasn't there to interview a conspiracy theorist. I was there to meet a ghost. For the sake of this video, we are going to call him Commander Miller. I verified his service record before I got on the plane. Ex-Dev Guru, Navy SEAL. The kind of Tier 1 operator whose missions are redacted before the ink is even dry. He spent 20 years working on black-budget projects, the kind of operations that officially do not exist. But the man sitting in the armchair by the fire wasn't the warrior his file described. He was disintegrating. That is the only way I can describe it. Miller was in the final stages of a condition his private doctors couldn't identify. His skin was translucent and gray. His veins were black. It looked like aggressive radiation poisoning, but there were no burns. It was a total systemic cellular necrosis, as if his biology was simply unraveling at the molecular level. He didn't have the energy for small talk. He simply reached into his jacket with a trembling hand and slid a heavy, military-grade hard drive across the wooden table. He looked me in the eye, struggling for every breath, and said, "We didn't stop exploring because of the cost. We stopped because we were given an eviction notice." Miller passed away 48 hours after I left that cabin. What I'm about to share with you comes directly from that drive. According to the files on the hard drive, the operation took place in October of 2009. The location was the Puerto Rico Trench, a scar in the Earth's crust that plunges down over 27,000 feet. It is the deepest point in the entire Atlantic Ocean, a place so hostile to human life that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about those depths. Miller was the mission commander aboard a vessel that officially does not exist. It was called the DSV Wraith. Unlike the research subs you see in National Geographic documentaries, clunky, bright yellow things with robotic arms, the Wraith was a weapon of stealth. It was constructed from a classified titanium ceramic composite designed not just to survive the crushing pressure of 800 atmospheres, but to move through the water with zero acoustic signature. It was a black hole in the water, invisible to sonar, silent as a grave. The official mission dossier, the one filed with the Pentagon, claimed they were on a search and recovery op. The cover story was that a prototype spy drone had malfunctioned and splashed down in the trench. and they needed to retrieve the sensitive technology before foreign powers could get to it. It was a clean, logical story. It was also a complete lie. Miller and his crew knew there was no drone. There was no crash site. Before they sealed the hatch, they were given a separate, handwritten briefing. For months, Navy SOSUS arrays, the underwater listening posts used to track Soviet subs during the Cold War, had been picking up an anomaly from the bottom of the trench. It wasn't a biological sound, and it wasn't tectonic shifting. It was a signal. Miller wrote that the mood inside the sub wasn't one of excitement. It was dread. They knew they weren't going down there to pick up debris. As he put it in his notes, we were hunting an echo. The descent of the DSV Wraith was not a plunge. It was a slow, calculated fall into the throat of the world. As the ballast tanks flooded and the sub slipped beneath the choppy waves of the Atlantic, the vibrant blue of the Caribbean water began to deepen into a bruised purple and finally into an absolute, crushing black. For the first hour, the crew remained silent, their eyes glued to the instrument panels, watching the depth gauge tick down digit by digit. The interior of the sub was a cramped sphere of titanium and screens, lit only by the soft red glow of the tactical lights designed to preserve their night vision. Outside, the pressure was building with every meter, a silent, invisible vice tightening around the hull. Miller described the feeling of the descent as leaving the planet itself. They were traveling to a place where the rules of biology and physics operated on a completely different scale, a hostile alien landscape that existed right here on Earth. As they passed through the twilight zone and entered the midnight zone, the ocean outside the viewports was still teeming with the strange, bioluminescent life that thrives in the dark. They saw flashes of light in the distance anglerfish, gulper eels, and jellies drifting like ghosts in the current. This was expected. The ocean, even in its depths, is usually a noisy, busy place. Hydrophones typically pick up the clicks of sperm whales hunting squid, the chatter of shrimp, and the shifting of currents. It is a cacophony of survival that never ends. But as the Wraith continued its silent fall, pushing past the 4,000-meter mark, the environment began to change in a way that none of the crew had been trained for. The bioluminescence began to fade, not gradually, but abruptly, as if a switch had been flipped, leaving them in a void so total it felt heavy on the eyes. However, it was at the 6,000-meter mark, the gateway to the Hadal Zone, that the mission parameters shifted from exploration to unease. According to every marine biology text in existence, life gets scarcer this deep, but it never truly disappears. There should be amphipods, sea cucumbers, bottom feeders that scavenge the marine snow falling from above. But Miller noted in the log that the ocean had become completely sterile. The sonar screens, which should have been pinging with the soft returns of biological mass, were completely blank. There were no fish. There were no microbes dense enough to register. It was a dead zone, a vacuum of life that extended for miles in every direction. The water outside wasn't just empty. It felt curated, cleared out, like a perimeter that had been sanitized of all organic intrusion. Miller described this depth as the dead layer, a term that does not exist in any oceanography textbook, but was whispered about in the black budget circles. The silence outside was absolute and terrifying. The usual background noise of the ocean, the noise floor, dropped to near zero. It was so quiet that the crew could hear the blood rushing in their own ears and the creaking of the cooling fans in the computer racks. This level of silence is unnatural in a fluid medium. The ocean is a conductor of sound, and it is never truly mute. To hear nothing meant that there was nothing out there to make a sound, or worse, that everything out there was hiding. The feeling of isolation was absolute, pressing in on their minds just as hard as the water pressed on the hull. Inside the pressurized sphere of the cockpit, the atmosphere became suffocatingly tense. The three men on board Miller, his pilot, and the sonar specialist exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. They were trained professionals, elite operators used to high-stress environments, but this was different. In a war zone, you know where the enemy is, or at least you know what the enemy looks like. Here, the enemy was the void itself. Miller checked the comms, but the link to the surface ship was already just a wash of static, severed by the miles of water and the unique interference of the trench. They were on their own, falling through a column of water that weighed as much as a mountain, into a silence that felt heavy with anticipation. It was in this oppressively silent void that the passive sonar array picked up the first anomaly. It started as a ghost on the screen, a faint ripple in the waterfall display that the sonar specialist initially dismissed as system noise. But it didn't disappear. It grew stronger, more defined. It wasn't the organic click of a whale or the random grinding of tectonic plates. It was a hum, a low-frequency, continuous drone that sat right at the edge of human hearing, more of a vibration than a sound. The specialist adjusted the gain, trying to isolate the signal, his face pale in the red light. "Sir," he whispered, breaking the silence of the cabin, "I'm picking up a background signature. It's constant. It's not biological." The sound was not merely an auditory hallucination. It was a physical sensation that began to vibrate through the hull of the Wraith. It felt electrical, distinct, and rhythmic. If you have ever stood near a high-voltage transformer or a massive server room, you know that specific heavy thrum of generated power. That is what they were hearing at 6,000 meters below the surface. A sound that implies industry, a sound that implies machinery. But that was impossible. They were deeper than any submarine could go, deeper than any cable had ever been laid. There was no power grid down here. There was no infrastructure. Yet, the sensors were screaming that they were approaching a massive source of electromagnetic energy. Miller wrote that the sound reminded him of standing next to a massive hydroelectric dam, the sound of millions of gallons of water being forced through turbines to generate gigawatts of power. It had a texture to it, a heavy churning consistency that made his teeth ache and the hair on his arms stand up. It was the sound of something working, something functioning on a massive scale in the utter dark. The crew tried to triangulate the source, hoping it was a glitch in the Wraith's experimental sensor suite. They ran diagnostics, reset the audio drivers, and checked the external hydrophones. The result was always the same. The equipment was working perfectly. The sound was real, and it was getting louder. The psychological effect of that hum was immediate and profound. It wasn't just annoying. It was inducing a deep primal sense of dread in the crew. Nausea began to set in, a low-level motion sickness that had nothing to do with the movement of the sub. It was an infrasonic reaction, the body's response to a frequency that shouldn't exist in nature. Miller described gripping the armrests of his command chair until his knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to order an emergency ballast blow. They were trained to fight men, to defuse bombs, to survive torture. They were not trained to endure the sound of a machine that was too big and too deep to exist. As they continued to drop, passing 7,000 meters, the frequency of the hum began to shift. It wasn't just a monotonal drone anymore. It began to oscillate. It had a pattern. It rose and fell in a complex wave structure that hinted at intelligence, or at least automated purpose. The sonar specialist looked at Miller, his eyes wide with a realization that shattered their cover story completely. "Commander," he said, his voice trembling, "that's not a crash site. That's not a drone. That is an active output. We are diving towards a generator." And at that moment, the bottom of the trench came into range of their bottom scan radar, and the mystery of the sound was replaced by the terror of what was making it. The sonar specialist, a man named Henderson who had spent his entire adult life listening to the secrets of the deep, was the first to realize that the chaos on his screen was actually order. Up until this point, the crew had treated the low-frequency hum as an anomaly, perhaps a geologic vent or a tectonic grinding that was vibrating at a weirdly consistent pitch. But as Henderson adjusted the frequency filters, stripping away the static of the water and the faint mechanical whir of the Wraith's own scrubbers, the waterfall display on his console sharpened. The amorphous blob of noise resolved into distinct, jagged spikes of data. He sat frozen, his hand hovering over the dials, his face draining of color in the red tactical light. He wasn't looking at a random natural event. He was looking at a sequence. The sound wasn't a drone. It was a broadcast. He routed the isolated audio to the main speakers, filling the cramped cockpit with the raw, unfiltered sound of the abyss. It came through as a series of heavy, percussive thuds, like a hammer striking an anvil deep underwater. Thump, thump, thump. Then a pause of absolute, heavy silence that lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then it began again. Thump, 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 thump. Another pause. The crew sat in stunned silence, counting the beats instinctively. The rhythm was crisp, precise, and devoid of the messy, organic fluctuation you hear in whale calls or volcanic vents. It sounded like a metronome set to a tempo that was meant to be understood, a deliberate communication attempting to bridge a gap between species. "It's counting," Henderson whispered, his voice barely audible over the thrum of the speakers. 7. Now it's doing 7. The crew listened as the 7 beats hammered against the hull, vibrating through the solace of their boots. Pause, then 11. Pause, then 13. Miller stared at the screen, his mind racing through every cryptographic training module he had ever taken. This wasn't Morse code. It wasn't binary. It was the most fundamental language in the universe. They were listening to a sequence of prime numbers integers divisible only by themselves in 1. It is the classic method theorized by astronomers for identifying extraterrestrial intelligence, the one signal that cannot be generated by a pulsar or a gas cloud. The implication of this simple mathematical sequence was more terrifying than any monster they could have imagined. Nature is chaotic. It creates fractals, spirals, and waves, but it does not count in primes. A volcano does not pause to do arithmetic. A giant squid does not tap out equations on the hull of a submarine. To hear this sequence at the bottom of the ocean meant that there was a mind down there. It meant that the source of the signal possessed logic, intent, and an understanding of abstract concepts. They were no longer investigating a crash site. They were stumbling into a classroom, and they were the ones being tested. The realization hit Miller with the force of a physical blow. They were not alone in the dark. The terror was compounded by the directionality of the sound. As the pilot made minute adjustments to the Wraith's descent vector, the signal strength fluctuated wildly. When they drifted to the left, the counting faded into static. When they corrected back to the center, the beats became deafeningly clear. They realized with dawning horror that the sound wasn't omnidirectional. It wasn't radiating out in all directions like a radio tower. It was a focused beam. It was a tight, coherent stream of acoustic energy aimed directly upwards, carving a path through the water column. They weren't just hearing a noise. They were inside a transmission cone. The signal was a lighthouse beam, and they were the ships caught in its glare. Miller looked at the depth gauge, 7,500 meters. The beam was guiding them. Whether it was an automated landing beacon for craft that didn't belong to humanity, or a lure designed to bring curious creatures down to be consumed, was impossible to say. But the precision was undeniable. The Wraith was sliding down a slide of sound, locked into a trajectory that had been mathematically defined by whatever was waiting at the bottom. The pilot looked back at Miller, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the cabin. "Commander, this is a guidance lock. We are being pulled in. Do we abort? Do we drop ballast and shoot for the surface?" It was the critical moment of the mission. Protocol for a situation like this didn't exist. If this were a Russian or Chinese listening post, the standard procedure would be to go silent and drift away. But no human power had the technology to build a transmitter that could withstand 800 atmospheres of pressure and broadcast a directed beam of this magnitude. If they aborted now, they would survive, but they would leave the greatest discovery in human history behind. If they continued, they were effectively answering the door to an unknown entity. Miller felt the weight of the decision pressing on his chest. The prime numbers continued to cycle in the background. 17, 1923, a relentless, logical drumbeat marching them toward destiny. "We continue," Miller said, his voice sounding stranger and detached even to his own ears. "Maintain the heading. Follow the numbers." He rationalized it as a soldier. They had a mission to recover a drone. But deep down, it was the explorer in him that took the wheel. He had to know. He had to see the face of the thing that knew algebra in the dark. The pilot swallowed hard, nodded, and pushed the yoke forward. The Wraith dipped its nose, committing fully to the descent. The hum grew louder, vibrating the fillings in their teeth as they rode the mathematical wave down into the crushing blackness of the trench floor. As they neared the 8,000-meter mark, the nature of the signal changed one last time. The spaces between the numbers began to fill with a secondary sound, a high-pitched, digital screeching that sounded like a dial-up modem from hell. It was data. Massive amounts of compressed information were being streamed within the carrier wave of the prime numbers. The sub's computers began to glitch, screens flickering as the electromagnetic interference spiked off the charts. The echo they had come to hunt was screaming at them now. The water around them seemed to vibrate with an energy that was almost visible, a prelude to the visual shock that was waiting for them just a few hundred meters below. They had left the world of biology behind. They had entered the domain of pure calculation. The ocean floor, which should have been a silent desert of silt and rock, was rushing up to meet them, and it was alive with the sound of 1 billion calculations per second. Miller gripped the console, watching the sonar screen turn into a solid wall of noise, bracing himself for impact. The math had led them here. Now, they were about to see the solution to the equation. And the solution was not a drone. It was a city of light where no light should exist. The altimeter readout flickered and finally settled on a steady number, 8,300 meters. They had reached the bottom of the world. According to every oceanographic map ever drawn, the floor of the Puerto Rico Trench should have been a desolate, muddy plain composed of millions of years of sediment and dead matter raining down from above. It should have been a soft, amorphous graveyard. But as the Wraith hovered there in the crushing darkness, the downward-facing collision sensors were reading something hard, flat, and impossibly smooth. The pilot's hands hovered over the external lighting controls, hesitating. In the deep ocean, turning on your lights is a double-edged sword. It allows you to see, but it also announces your presence to anything with eyes. With a nod from Miller, the pilot flipped the switch, and the high-intensity halogen floodlights burst into life, cutting through the eternal bloom like a knife. The first thing that hit them was the lack of reflection. Usually, when you shine a light on the seabed, you see the beige or gray reflection of silt. Here, the light seemed to be swallowed. As their eyes adjusted to the sudden brightness, the shape of the terrain below them began to emerge, and a collective gasp sucked the air out of the cabin. They were not floating above mud. They were floating above a grid. Stretching out in every direction, as far as the lights could reach, was a colossal, geometric lattice made of a material that looked like matte black obsidian. It was a tessellated surface of interlocking hexagons, each one the size of a football field, fused together with a precision that mocked human engineering. There were no rivets, no seams, no welding marks. It was a single, continuous sheet of dark matter that paved the ocean floor. Miller pressed his face against the thick, reinforced glass of the viewport, trying to comprehend the scale of what he was seeing. This wasn't a ruin. Ruins are broken. They are covered in growth and sediment. This surface was pristine. It was spotless, as if it had been polished that very morning. The sheer impossibility of it made his brain reel. They were looking at a construction project that covered thousands of square miles, hidden under 5 miles of water. If this was a secret military base, it would have required the GDP of the entire planet and 100 years to build. But it didn't look human. It lacked the utilitarian chaos of our technology. It was too perfect, too cold, too mathematical. It looked like the exterior of a microchip magnified 1 billion times. Then the pulse began. It started deep within the black honeycomb structure, a faint glow rising from the interstices of the grid. It wasn't white or yellow. It was a deep, sickly violet, a color that sat right on the edge of the ultraviolet spectrum, making it painful to look at directly. The light didn't behave like light in water usually does. It didn't scatter or diffuse into a soft glow. It moved like a liquid. It oozed up from the cracks in the grid like glowing oil, clinging to the black metal, swirling and coalescing in slow, hypnotic patterns. Miller described it as viscous light, a heavy, radioactive luminescence that seemed to possess mass and weight. It looked less like illumination and more like a waste product or perhaps a fuel source bleeding out from the engine beneath. As the violet light intensified, it revealed the true depth of the structure. The hexagonal tiles weren't just flat pavers. They were the roof. Through the gaps where the light was escaping, the crew could see down into the structure itself. There were layers upon layers of machinery moving deep below them, massive pistons the size of skyscrapers shifting in silence, gears of dark crystal rotating in the deep purple haze. It was a glimpse into a subterranean industrial complex of terrifying magnitude. The city wasn't built on the ocean floor. It was the ocean floor. The crust of the earth had been replaced, or perhaps covered, by this technological skin. The realization made the wraith feel incredibly fragile, a tiny metal mosquito hovering over the chest of a sleeping giant. The way the light interacted with the water was the most disturbing detail. Where the violet glow touched the seawater, the water seemed to thicken and distort, rippling with a strange gelatinous quality. Miller wrote that it looked as if the light was infecting the ocean, rewriting the physics of the water molecules around it. It created a halo of distortion that messed with their depth perception. It was beautiful in the way a nuclear explosion is beautiful, awful, majestic, and fundamentally wrong. The crew watched in horrified fascination as the pulse sensed up with the sound they had been hearing. Thump. The light flared bright violet. Silence. The light dimmed to a dull bruise color. The entire seabed was breathing. "It's not a city," Miller whispered, his voice trembling as he spoke into the recorder. "There are no windows. There are no doors. There are no roads." He was an expert in tactical assessment, trained to look at a target and understand its function. A city is designed for inhabitants. It has flow, it has entrances, it has living spaces. This place had none of that. It was a closed loop. It was a solid block of function. "It's a machine," he corrected himself. "The whole trench. It's a cooling system for a machine." The idea was nauseating. They weren't visiting a civilization. They were walking on top of a server farm or a generator that had been running in the dark for eons. The sensors on the Wraith began to scream again as the radiation levels spiked. The violet light wasn't just visual. It was emitting hard radiation, a strange isotope that the Geiger counters couldn't identify. The hull of the sub began to groan, the metal reacting to the energy field rising from below. The pilot fought the controls as the water around them became turbulent, churned by the heat and energy of the grid. They were being cooked in the radiation of this alien technology. Yet they couldn't look away. The hypnotic rhythm of the violet pulse was mesmerizing, pulling at their consciousness, inviting them to open the hatch and swim down into the light. Miller snapped out of the trance, his survival instincts kicking in. He realized that the drone story was a complete fabrication by intelligence officers who probably knew exactly what was down here or at least suspected it. They hadn't been sent to recover anything. They had been sent as a probe. They were the stick being poked into the hornet's nest to see what would happen. And now, hovering just 50 meters above the grid, they were about to find out. The pulsing light wasn't just a byproduct of the machine. It was a scanning field. And as the violet glow washed over the hull of the Wraith, the machine acknowledged their presence. The grid changed. The hexagonal plates directly beneath them began to shift, sliding open with a sound that vibrated through the water like a grinding tectonic plate. The light became blinding, shooting up in a focused pillar that engulfed the submarine. They weren't observing anymore. They were being observed. The machine had woken up. Miller grabbed the comms, shouting for an abort, but the radio was dead. The violet light filled the cockpit, washing out the red tactical lamps, bathing their terrified faces in the color of a bruised sky. And from the opening in the grid below, something began to rise to meet them. Here is the script for Part 5, detailing the terrifying encounter with technology that defies the laws of physics. Miller knew, even as he gave the order, that they were crossing a line from which there might be no return. The mission parameters were explicit: observe and collect. Faced with the most significant discovery in the history of the human race, the drive to bring back physical proof overruled the instinct for self-preservation. He nodded to the pilot, who engaged the Wraith's external manipulator arm. With a hydraulic whine that vibrated through the hull, the robotic limb extended, holding a diamond-tipped core sampler designed to drill into rock. They were aiming for a raised section of the black geometric grid, a ridge that looked like a junction point. It was an act of supreme arrogance, a flea attempting to bite an elephant to see what its blood tasted like. As the drill bit spun up and made contact with the obsidian surface, the entire ocean seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the reaction. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The moment the drill touched the black metal, the violet light pulsating through the city flared into a blinding white. The grid didn't just sit there. It responded like an immune system detecting a virus. 3 perfectly circular iris hatches slid open in the structure surrounding the Wraith, moving with a silent, frictionless speed that no mechanical gear should possess. From these dark silos, 3 objects emerged. They were not missiles, and they were not torpedoes. They were spheres perfect, flawless orbs of polished silver, each about the size of a compact car. They rose from the depths without buoyancy, hovering in the water with a terrifying stability, reflecting the Wraith's floodlights like funhouse mirrors in the abyss. What happened next broke Miller's understanding of physics. In the water, movement requires displacement. To move forward, you have to push water backward. You need a propeller, a jet, a fin. These spheres had none of that. They were completely smooth, seamless chrome balls with no visible propulsion systems, no exhaust ports, and no control surfaces. Yet, they moved. One moment they were stationary above the grid, and the next, they were 300 meters away, closing the distance to the submarine. They didn't accelerate. They simply existed in one spot and then existed in another, bridging the gap with a speed that blurred the vision. It was the movement of a cursor on a computer screen, not a physical object moving through a dense fluid medium. The speed at which they moved was mathematically impossible. Miller watched the tactical display in horror as the telemetry updated. The spheres accelerated from 0 to 300 knots in a fraction of a second. Under the laws of inertia, any biological pilot inside those spheres would have been turned to jelly by the G-force, and any electronic equipment would have been crushed. Furthermore, an object moving that fast underwater should create a massive sonic boom and supercavitation. Bubbles a trail of boiling water caused by friction. These objects created nothing. No wake, no bubbles, no sound. They sliced through the water as if the water wasn't there, or as if they were encased in a bubble of vacuum that removed friction entirely from the equation. The pilot screamed a warning, his hands flying over the controls to initiate an emergency evasive maneuver, but it was already too late. The spheres weren't just fast, they were coordinated. They moved with a hive mind synchronization, anticipating the Wraith's movements before the pilot even executed them. They banked and turned at sharp 90-degree angles without losing speed, a maneuver that should have ripped them apart. Within seconds, they had positioned themselves around the submarine, one directly in front of the viewport, and 2 flanking the rear thrusters. They formed a perfect, equilateral triangle with the Wraith trapped in the center. It was a kill box, a classic aerial combat tactic executed at the bottom of the ocean by spheres that had no wings. Miller stared out the front viewport, face to face with the lid sphere. Up close, it was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen, simply because of its lack of features. It was a blank, silver eye. There were no rivets, no seams, no scratches. It reflected the terrified faces of the crew back at them, distorted by the curvature of the chrome. The sphere hovered just 10 feet from the glass, completely motionless now, holding its position against the deep ocean currents with absolute rigidity. It was analyzing them. Miller could feel it. The object wasn't just a drone, it was a sentry. And the Wraith, the pinnacle of human stealth technology, was being inspected like a toy boat in a bathtub. The sensors on the Wraith were going haywire, trying to make sense of the intruders. The thermal imaging showed nothing. The spheres were the exact same temperature as the surrounding water, meaning they generated zero waste heat, which violates the second law of thermodynamics. The sonar couldn't lock onto them. The pings just slid off their curved surfaces or were absorbed entirely. To the submarine's computer, they were ghosts. They were holes in reality where data should be. Yet, they were physically there, blocking the path, radiating a menace that was palpable. The hum of the violet city below had stopped, replaced by a high-pitched, piercing whine coming from the spheres themselves, a sound that drilled into the crew's skulls. Full reverse. "Get us out of here," Miller barked, his voice cracking. The pilot slammed the throttle back, engaging the main thrusters to pull the sub away from the nightmare. The engines roared, the propellers spun, churning the water into a frothy white cloud. But the Wraith didn't move. It shuddered violently, straining against invisible chains, but it didn't inch backward a single millimeter. The engines whined in protest, the RPMs redlining, but they were held fast in the center of the triangle. It wasn't a mechanical grapple. It was a gravitational lock. The spheres were manipulating the water pressure or the localized gravity around the sub to hold it in place. Panic began to set in. The crew realized they were not in a vehicle anymore. They were in a cage. The spheres maintained their formation perfectly, indifferent to the Wraith's struggle. The lid sphere drifted closer, inch by agonizing inch, until it was filling the entire field of view. The violet light from the city below reflected off its surface, painting the chrome with swirling, sickly purple patterns. Inside the cockpit, the air grew heavy and static-charged, the hairs on their arms standing up. The smell of ozone filled the recycled air. The spheres were powering up something, charging a weapon or a tool that human science couldn't begin to comprehend. At that moment, the concept of superiority died for Miller. He was a Navy SEAL, a member of the most elite fighting force on the planet, backed by the most powerful military in history. But down here, facing these silver geometries, he was nothing. He was a primitive savage throwing rocks at a tank. The Wraith was pinned, helpless, caught in a web of impossible physics spun by entities that viewed inertia as a suggestion rather than a law. The interrogation was about to begin, and the interceptors weren't going to use words. They were going to use something far more invasive. Then, the world went black. It wasn't a gradual dimming of the systems. It was an instantaneous, total blackout. Every screen, every tactical light, every LED indicator inside the Wraith died simultaneously. The hum of the life support scrubbers cut out, leaving them in a silence so profound it felt heavy. For a few terrifying seconds, the only light came from the violet pulsation of the city outside, filtering through the thick viewport glass, casting long, moving shadows across the dead instruments. They were trapped in a titanium coffin at the bottom of the world, stripped of the technology that kept them alive. The fear was no longer about the mission. It was a primal panic about suffocation and darkness, the oldest fears of the human animal rising to the surface. Immediately following the blackout, the temperature inside the pressure sphere plummeted. It wasn't a natural cooling. It was a flash freeze. The air inside the cabin turned instantly into a fog of condensed breath. Frost began to spiderweb across the inside of the titanium hull and the glass of the viewports. It felt as though the silver spheres outside were acting as thermal vampires, leaching the heat energy directly out of the submarine and its crew. Miller wrote that the cold didn't just touch his skin. It seemed to penetrate his muscles and settle in his bones. His teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, not just from the temperature, but from a sudden, overwhelming onset of shock. They were being thermodynamically dismantled. Then came the pressure. It didn't come from the water outside. It came from inside their own skulls. It started as a high-pitched ringing, like tinnitus, but it quickly swelled into a sensation of physical expansion, as if their brains were swelling against the confines of their craniums. It was a headache that defied description, a sharp, drilling agony that was centered directly behind the eyes. Miller clutched his head, groaning, realizing that the pilot and the sonar specialist were doing the same. It wasn't a sound wave entering through their ears. It was a direct resonance with the neural tissue of the cerebral cortex. The spheres were broadcasting a signal that bypassed the auditory nerves entirely and interacted directly with their consciousness. In the faint violet twilight of the cabin, Miller saw the pilot turn towards him, his eyes wide with confusion and pain. That's when he saw the blood. A dark, thick stream was running from the pilot's left nostril, tracking down over his lip and dripping onto his flight suit. Miller reached up to touch his own face and pulled his hand away wet. They were all bleeding. The resonance was rupturing the delicate capillaries in their nasal cavities and sinuses. It was a synchronized biological failure. The intensity of the signal was cooking their biology from the inside out, vibrating their soft tissue until it tore. They were three men bleeding in the dark, held captive by a force that didn't need to touch them to hurt them. The noise inside their heads reached a crescendo, a screaming static that obliterated all ability to think or speak. It was an invasive, violent intrusion, a forced upload of data into a biological hard drive that wasn't formatted to receive it. Miller described it as synesthesia gone wrong. He could taste the sound. It tasted like copper and ozone. He could see the sound flashes of white geometry exploding behind his eyelids. His brain was trying to interpret a form of communication that was never meant for human neurology. The spheres weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking at all. They were projecting raw concepts, entire blocks of information and intent, directly into the crew's minds. The first concept that solidified out of the chaos was identity, but it wasn't a greeting. It was a classification. The alien mind didn't view them as explorers or soldiers or even as intelligent life. The concept that flooded Miller's mind was biological and clinical. The word that formed in his thoughts, translated by his struggling brain, was pathogen. They were being viewed as a virus, a containment breach. The entities outside looked at the wraith the same way a white blood cell looks at a bacteria entering the bloodstream. There was no hatred in the signal, only a cold, sterile recognition of something that was dirty and out of place. It was a crushing blow to human ego to be looked at not with curiosity, but with disgust. The second concept was geography, but rewritten. A mental map was forced into their minds. They saw the earth, but not as we see it. They saw the surface, the continents, the shallow seas as a chaotic, infected petri dish. Then they saw the deep, the hadal zones, the trenches as the clean room, the sterile laboratory. The message was clear. The ocean depth is not a frontier for humanity to conquer. It is a wall. It is a quarantine line. The concept of barrier was slammed into their thoughts with the force of a physical command. The surface belongs to the chaos of biology. The abyss belongs to the order of the machine. The treaty wasn't something signed on paper. It was a law of physics they had just broken. The final concept was the ultimatum. It wasn't a threat of war. It was a notification of hygiene protocols. The idea was simple, absolute, and terrifying. Sterilization. If they did not retreat, if they crossed the threshold again, the reaction would not be diplomatic. It would be an erasure. The spheres conveyed the ability to simply unmake them, to cease their biological function as easily as turning off a light switch. Miller felt the certainty of this threat in his marrow. These entities didn't bluff. They had the power to cleanse the ocean of the human infection instantly. It was a warning delivered with the indifference of a gardener deciding whether to pull a weed. The intensity of the psychic pressure became unbearable. Miller felt like he was on the verge of a stroke. The pilot was screaming silently, his mouth open in a rictus of agony, blood now flowing freely from both nostrils and his ears. The Wraith was vibrating violently, not from the water, but from the sheer energy being directed at it. They were moments away from death, their brains about to liquefy under the strain of the alien transmission. They had seen the face of God, and it was a cold, metallic machine that wanted them dead. They were insignificant, fragile, and unwanted in the house of the deep. Then, as abruptly as it began, the pressure vanished. The spheres broke the connection. The silence rushed back into the cabin, leaving the crew gasping for air, clutching their chests, traumatized and broken. The message had been delivered. The experiment was over. The lab rats had been shocked, and now it was time to discard them. The Wraith groaned, the metal complaining as the gravitational lock was released. They weren't being set free. They were being thrown out. And as Miller looked up, wiping the blood from his eyes, he realized the journey up was going to be just as impossible as the things he had just seen. The release, when it finally came, was more violent than the capture. The three silver spheres didn't just drift away. They pulsed once in unison, emitting a shockwave of kinetic energy that hit the Wraith directly from below. It felt as though the ocean floor itself had kicked them. Miller was thrown back into his command chair, the breath knocked out of his lungs, as the submarine was launched upwards with the velocity of a missile. There was no slow release of ballast, no gradual buoyancy control. They were being ejected from the deep. The sensation was sickening, a feeling of falling up, where gravity seemed to reverse itself, pinning them to their seats with crushing force. The navigation computer, which had rebooted in emergency mode, showed their ascent rate climbing to numbers that were mechanically suicidal. They were ascending at speeds that no submersible, military or civilian, was ever designed to withstand. According to the laws of physics, every person inside that pressure hull should have been dead within the first minute. Rapid decompression is one of the most gruesome ways to die. As you rise from the deep, the nitrogen dissolved in your blood expands into bubbles. If you ascend too fast, your blood essentially turns into soda foam, causing strokes, heart attacks, and agonizing joint pain. Divers call it the bends, but at this speed, it would have been an explosive event. The Wraith was rocketing up from 8,000 meters, a vertical sprint that should have taken hours to do safely. Instead, they were covering the distance in minutes. Miller braced himself for the inevitable seizure, for the feeling of his veins bursting, but the pain never came. The blood drying on his face remained still. His breathing, though ragged, was unobstructed. The reason for their survival was visible through the reinforced glass of the viewports. Encasing the entire submarine was a shimmering, translucent field, a bubble of distorted energy that moved with them. It looked like oil on water, a swirling iridescence that separated the titanium hull from the crushing ocean outside. This bubble was an inertial dampener of some kind, a piece of alien technology that isolated the Wraith from the surrounding environment. Inside the field, the pressure remained constant and the G-forces were neutralized. The entities down below hadn't just thrown them out. They had wrapped them in a protective envelope to ensure they survived the journey, perhaps so they could deliver the warning to the rest of their species. They were being shipped back to the surface in a cosmic packing crate. The ascent was a blur of changing colors. Usually, rising from the abyss is a slow transition from black to indigo to deep blue and finally to the turquoise of the surface. But the Wraith was moving so fast that the layers of the ocean smeared together. The midnight zone flashed by in seconds. The twilight zone was a brief gray wash. The bioluminescent creatures of the deep were just streaks of light painting the windows, unable to react fast enough to get out of the way. Miller watched the depth gauge spinning backward like a broken clock 6,000 meters, 4,000 meters, 2,000 meters. It was a terrifying silent elevator ride to the top of the world, powered by a force they couldn't control or understand. The hull groaned under the stress, the metal complaining against the unnatural forces acting upon it, but the alien bubble held firm. At 500 meters, the light of the sun began to penetrate the water. A sudden, blinding shift from the eternal night they had just left. The water turned a brilliant, shocking blue. And then they breached. The Wraith hit the surface not with a gentle bob, but with the force of a breaching whale. The submarine launched completely out of the water, hanging in the air for a breathless second, a multi-ton titanium beast suspended in the tropical sun before crashing back down with a massive splash that shook the entire vessel. The impact triggered every alarm in the cockpit that hadn't already fused. They bobbed violently in the swell, the ocean foam washing over the viewports, the sun glaring down on them with an intensity that hurt their dilated pupils. Silence returned to the cockpit, broken only by the hum of the backup battery engaging and the sound of the crew gasping for air. They were alive. Against all probability, against all logic, they were bobbing on the surface of the Atlantic. Miller unbuckled his harness, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the clasps. He looked at the pilot and the specialist. They were pale, covered in dried blood from their noses and ears, looking like ghosts who had just clawed their way out of a grave. No one spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. They just stared at the blue sky through the glass, trying to reconcile the nightmare of the violet city with the mundane reality of the sun and clouds. Then the radio crackled to life. The static cleared, replaced by the frantic, shouting voice of the communications officer on the support ship, the USS Manticore. Wraith, command to Wraith. Do you copy? Report status. Got him, Miller. Answer us. The voice was edged with a level of panic that didn't make sense for a simple loss of contact. Miller grabbed the handset, his throat dry and raw. Manticore, this is Wraith, he rasped. We are topside. Mission abort. We have sustained structural stress. Requesting immediate pickup. He tried to sound professional, but he knew he sounded like a broken man. There was a pause on the other end, a silence that felt heavy. Then the voice came back, confused and breathless. Topside? Confirm, Wraith. You are on the surface? Your transponder just appeared out of nowhere. Miller frowned, looking at the mission clock on his dashboard. According to the sub's internal chronometer, the entire dive from the moment they submerged to the moment they breached had taken exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes. They had gone down, seen the city, and been ejected. It was a short, violent trip. Affirmative, Manticore. We are surfacing. Mission clock reads T+2 hours. Commander, the voice on the radio hesitated. Check your sync. Sir, we lost contact with you over 9 hours ago. We have been circling the drop zone all day. We were preparing to declare you Kier. The sun is setting, sir. You've been gone all day. Miller looked out the viewport. He had assumed the brightness was the midday sun, but as he looked closer at the horizon, he saw the orange bleeding into the sky. It was dusk. He looked back at his wristwatch, then at the sub's clock. Both said 14 o'clock hours. The world outside said it was 21 o'clock hours. A chill that had nothing to do with the ocean temperature settled over Miller. 7 hours were missing. 7 hours of time had simply evaporated. The physics of it hit him hard. Time dilation. General relativity states that time moves slower near massive gravitational fields. But they hadn't been near a black hole. They had been near the machine. The energy output of that grid down there was so immense, so gravitationally dense, that it had literally warped the fabric of space-time around the submarine. To the crew, it was 20 minutes in the city. To the universe, it was 7 hours. They hadn't just traveled through space, they had traveled through time. And as the recovery boat approached, Miller realized that the distance between him and the rest of humanity wasn't just physical anymore. He had lived in a different timeline, and he wasn't sure he had fully come back. The recovery of the DSV Wraith did not look like a rescue. It looked like a crime scene cleanup. When the support ship hauled the submarine onto the deck, armed MPs immediately surrounded it. The hatch was blown open, and Miller and his crew were not taken to the infirmary. They were dragged by men in hazmat suits into a mobile isolation module welded to the deck. There were no debriefings, no handshakes, no calls to family. They were treated as biological contaminants. The ship turned around and steamed full speed for a black site naval facility in Virginia, maintaining total radio silence. Miller remembers looking out the small porthole of the isolation unit, watching the ocean disappear, and realizing that the water he had dedicated his life to was no longer a frontier. It was a hostile border that he had illegally crossed. For the next 3 weeks, Miller existed in a white room with no windows. He was subjected to a battery of medical tests that were invasive and baffling. The doctors weren't looking for the bends. They were looking for genetic drift. They took bone marrow samples, spinal fluid, and biopsies of the skin on his face that had been exposed to the strange violet light. They found that his cells were vibrating at a slightly different atomic frequency than before, a residue of the time dilation he had experienced. He was slowly dying, his DN unraveling like an old rope, a condition the doctors discussed in hushed tones as abyssal necrosis. He wasn't just sick. He was incompatible with the surface world he had returned to. The machine down there had changed him, marking him as a trespasser on a molecular level. The interrogation began on the 4th day. The men who entered the room didn't wear uniforms. They didn't have name tags, ranks, or insignias. They wore expensive, ill-fitting gray suits and spoke with the flat, sterile affect of bureaucrats who manage the end of the world. They didn't ask Miller what he saw. They didn't ask about the spheres or the grid. They asked specific, confirming questions that terrified Miller more than ignorance would have. They asked, did the interceptors engage kinetically? Did you receive the sterilization protocol? Did the geometry shift? They knew. They already knew everything. The mission wasn't about discovery. It was a stress test. They had sent the Wraith down there to see if the treaty was still in effect, using Miller and his men as canary birds in a coal mine. Miller never saw his crew again. The pilot and the sonar specialist were removed from their cells one night while Miller slept. When he asked about them the next morning, the suits simply said they had been transferred to a facility better equipped to handle their condition. It was a lie, and a lazy one at that. Miller knew the look of a cleanup operation. They were loose ends. Perhaps they had broken under the psychic pressure, or perhaps they had started talking. Miller survived only because he was the commander, and because he possessed a level of psychological compartmentalization that allowed him to remain useful. But he knew, with a sinking certainty, that his friends were dead casualties of a war that humanity didn't even know it was fighting. As for the Wraith, it ceased to exist. Miller later learned through back channels that the submarine was deemed too radioactive and structurally compromised to be salvaged. It was cut into scrap metal, encased in concrete, and buried in a nuclear waste repository in the Nevada desert. The logbooks were burned. The digital recordings were wiped. The mission was scrubbed from the Naval Register as if it had never happened. Officially, Miller had been injured during a training accident off the coast of Florida. The narrative was sanitized, wrapped in a bow, and filed away in the deepest basement of the Pentagon. The world went on spinning, completely unaware that just a few miles down, a super-civilization was watching the clock. In his final years, living in that cabin in Alaska, Miller pieced together the truth of the Abyssal Treaty. It isn't a document signed by presidents and alien ambassadors. It is a silent, terrifying understanding born of fear. We don't explore the deep ocean because we lack the technology. We have the tech. We don't go down there because we are afraid. The governments of the world, the US, Russia, China, they all know. They have probed the boundaries, and every time, they have been smacked down. The message has been consistent for decades. The surface is yours. The deep is ours. Stay in your lane, or we will wipe the board clean. This explains everything. It explains why NASA gets billions to look at dead rocks in space while NOAA fights for scraps to map our own planet. It explains why we stopped sending manned missions to the Mariana Trench. It explains the sudden cancellation of deep-sea mining projects. We are not the landlords of Earth. We are the tenants living in the attic, terrified of making too much noise lest we wake up the owners living in the basement. The Violet City isn't just a machine, it's a regulator. It maintains the planet's core, its magnetic field, its very stability. We are allowed to exist only as long as we don't interfere with the machinery that keeps the lights on. Miller handed me that hard drive because he was tired of carrying the weight of the lie. He looked at me with those dying, gray eyes and said, "We call ourselves the apex predators, but we are just algae floating on the surface of a pond, completely ignorant of the leviathans swimming beneath us." He died 2 days after I left the cabin. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure brought on by pneumonia. But looking at the photos in the file, seeing the way his skin had turned the color of ash, I know the truth. The machine finally finished the job it started in 2009. He didn't die of natural causes. He was sterilized. So, the next time you look out at the ocean and see that beautiful, endless blue horizon, remember this story. Remember that the calm surface is a lie. Beneath the waves, in the crushing dark where the pressure turns bone to dust, there is a line drawn in the sand. There are guardians watching, waiting for us to make a mistake. We are safe for now, as long as we stay up here in the sun. But the ocean is rising. The environment is changing. And the real question, the one that kept Miller awake at night, is simple. What happens when the machine decides that the pathogen on the surface has become too dangerous to tolerate? What happens when the sterilization protocol isn't just for a submarine, but for the whole world? If you want to uncover more secrets that the powers that be don't want you to know, and if you're brave enough to look into the dark, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are just scratching the surface of what's hidden on this planet. Rest in peace, Commander Miller. And to the rest of you, stay safe, stay curious, and for God's sake, stay out of the water. I'll see you in the next one.